All right, large South African corporates and government departments prove easy pickings for cyber criminals, and consumers are often the ones left out of pocket. The Cyber Crimes Act of 2021 handed authorities additional powers to investigate ransomware attacks and data crimes. But the question is it working? Let's bring in Simon Colman from the SHA Risk Specialists. Simon, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. I mean, it just seems that there are more and more reports than there ever were, let's say 5 years ago, when it comes to cyber attacks. We've heard Discam being the recent victim. It was all over the news this week, and potentially, what was it, 3.5 million clients, details there being compromised. It looks like it's getting worse and a bit more susceptible. I mean, do you get that sense because more and more companies are going online after COVID?
Yeah, good evening, Devan, and thank you. I think it is escalating, but we also have to bear in mind, of course, since the protection of personal information legislation came into full effect, businesses are obviously obliged to disclose when they've had a breach. So I think we're really talking about a combination of increased attacks, but then also businesses just being a little bit more open perhaps than they would have been prior to the act coming out. It's definitely getting worse though. We're seeing it just from a claims perspective as an insurer as well.
And I think I see your point that you're bringing up about the fact that, look, perhaps law makes it a bit more compelling. And I kind of see that when you see the fact that in the cases of TransUnion, for example, and Discam, they were told much earlier than they released the information, of course, to the public about those attacks. Why does it generally take so long for the companies to say, look, you know, we found out 2 weeks ago that we were under attack cyber-wise?
Yeah, look, I think, there's a lot going on when there's been a breach. And firstly, the company has to establish whether they have in fact been breached, because it's also possible that the cyber criminals reach out. They might not have actually gained access to the system, trying to elicit some kind of extortion amount, even though they haven't gained access. So there's a lot of investigation, forensic work that gets done before the company can really establish that something has happened. And often I think that message only really goes out to the public once the company's decided that they're not actually going to pay the ransom, and they're now going to run the risk of the cyber criminals actually releasing the data onto the dark web. So, but there are always going to be delays. These are complex matters. I mean, I don't know about you, but certainly from my perspective, when I sit in these very technical meetings, you realize that there's just layers and layers of security, technology. They've got to work through all of those before they really know what's happened.
The headlines are gripping, though, when you hear what kind of companies come under attack. I mean, in the case of TransUnion, 3.5 million, details being compromised of people, 3.5 million, same with Discam. So those headlines can be quite gripping. Now, we're often seeing very harsh consequences of these hackings for people on the ground, actual clients whose details have been compromised.
Yeah, look, there haven't really been a lot of liability suits or litigation against businesses by consumers who've had their details stolen. I think that's still in the pipeline. But certainly if you look abroad in the US and in some of the European countries, those things are happening. The difficulty, of course, is, I think those numbers you were reading out, and there's a long list of other breaches. I know the Deeds Office details were also published on the dark web about 6 years ago. So you can almost be guaranteed that pretty much every South African has had their details compromised at some point. Linking that to an actual loss suffered by an individual is quite difficult. Most of these things turn into identity theft crimes once the details have been compromised. And then, of course, you'd find a consumer coming forward and saying, look, someone took a loan out in my name. It wasn't me. And I think that that this relates to that data breach that happened at Discam or at TransUnion, to use your examples. But then linking that loss to that specific breach is also a challenge, because as we've already established, all of our details are already floating around on the dark web. So it's going to be challenging, I think, before we see those cases coming up. But they are on the horizon, that's for sure.
And it's costing companies a whole lot more, because if you look at the start of COVID, you've had laptops leaving companies, going home for obvious reasons. I'm wondering whether or not these devices become a bit more vulnerable when they leave the office and go home.
Well, definitely. I think the lockdown created a number of opportunities for cyber criminals. You know, you've mentioned the one where you've got people working off-site, but there was also a level of complacency that crept in. You know, someone working in an office behaves differently to the way they do when they're sitting at home in their home office or on the couch, or, you know, sometimes even on the bed. Yep. So there was I think a level of false security there. And businesses, of course, also had another problem when we went into lockdown. You know, virtual private networks, or VPNs, that's really the safest way that you can access the company network remotely. And most companies were not geared up to having all of their staff on these VPNs at the same time. So we know of some instances where people were allowed to connect to the company network without going through that secure pipeline. And hackers also knew that, you know, so there were many opportunities that came out of it. And then, of course, I think we were all sort of, you know, you're eNCA. I had the TV on in the background while I was working. So there were a lot of distractions during that time. And, yeah, we paid the price. We definitely seen a spike in cyber attacks during that period.
And just lastly, Simon, you think we're getting a grip on it now? There's been a realization that this is real and it could worsen if you do not act appropriately. And I'm talking about the big government departments and the companies here.
Look, I think businesses are spending a lot of money, especially in the corporate sector, on cybersecurity. But the criminals do always seem to be one step ahead. I think where we should really be focusing our attention is on SMEs, because, you know, our studies recently have shown that there's a complete lack of awareness there. They think they're not going to be targeted because they don't have valuable data. But that's where the thousands of losses are happening with ransomware. So we really need to increase our awareness across the spectrum. But my suggestion is that there's a lot more focus placed on the small to medium-sized sector.
All right, now fair enough. Well, thanks very much indeed. Business Head of Digital and Financial Lines at SHA Risk Specialist, Simon Colman. Thanks indeed for chatting to us.